Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take massive stacks of history, research, and analysis and distill them into the essential knowledge you need to be quickly and thoroughly informed.
And today we're undertaking a really spectacular 50-year sprint.
Yeah, we're charting the improbable, honestly, the dizzying rise of the House of Osman.
Yeah.
We're talking about a tiny Anatolian principality that in just 3 generations becomes this transcontinental empire.
And then almost instantly crashes and burns. It's truly one of history's most compelling stories. It's about strategic speed, but also institutional resilience.
Right.
If you look at a map from around 1350, the Ottomans, under a ruler named Orhan Ghazi, were just one of many small Turkish principalities in Asia Minor. They called them the Beyliks.
And they weren't even the strongest of them, right?
Not at all, not by a long shot. They perhaps commanded a mere 400 fighting men at the very beginning. Yet by 1402, they'd humbled Europe's largest armies and were, getting ready to conquer Constantinople.
That velocity is just astonishing. And to help all of you grasp the sheer pace of this, we're going to frame this deep dive using a specific analogy.
Which I think works perfectly here.
It really does. We're treating the early Ottoman state as a high-growth, early-stage startup, one that needed to go global, achieve a transcontinental IPO, if you will, before running into its first massive existential crisis.
It's a perfect fit because the successive leaders, they weren't just conquerors in the old sense, they were more like founders. And each one added a specific layer of necessary infrastructure to the company.
Exactly. So Orhan, the first ruler we're going to focus on, he's the pioneer. He establishes that first crucial international branch by crossing the Hellespont into Europe.
That's the key geographical breakthrough. That's what turns them from a purely local concern into a real regional power.
Then his son, Murad I, comes along. He's the true genius, maybe the chief operating officer of this whole operation. He recognized that raw conquest, well, it doesn't scale. So he builds the foundational corporate framework, the HR system, you could say, this meritocratic ruling institution, and the Janissary military corps.
And that infrastructure is the only reason the state survives what's coming next.
Because what comes next is Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt. He's the aggressive CEO pushing for total market dominance.
He's the one who attempts the rapid, hostile takeover of all the local competitors. He just starts annexing everything in Anatolia, aiming for, total market saturation.
And like a classic cautionary tale of graying too fast, of overextension.
The whole thing culminates in this catastrophic collision. Bayezid runs headlong into the established global monopoly, Timur or Tamerlane. The result is what you could call a near-total bankruptcy filing at the Battle of Ankara in 1402.
So our mission today is to unpack how these 3 generations engineered a state whose systems were so robust, so utterly resilient, that even when the sovereign was captured, the dynasty was basically decapitated and the territory carved up. The whole structure didn't collapse.
It survived.
It survived. Okay, let's unpack this journey, starting with that first critical move west. So let's start the clock around 1350. We're diving into the crossing. Orhan Ghazi in the bridgehead to Europe. Our sources make it so clear that the Ottomans' beginnings were anything but imperial.
Oh, not at all. They were, in the words of some historians, simple pastoral folk. When we talk about this early period under Osman and his son Orhan, the actual scope of their power was, well, it was tiny.
So how limited are we talking here?
Incredibly limited, geographically speaking. They were perched on the northwest corner of Anatolia, right up against the Byzantine heartland. That was strategically useful, of course.
But they were by no means the strongest military factor in Asia Minor.
No. We often read about the great Ottoman conquest of Anatolia, but you have to remember rival Turkish emirates like Karaman were just as, if not more, formidable at the time.
So the drive to expand wasn't necessarily this push of inherent strength against some overwhelming weakness.
No, it was really a move of strategic necessity. The sources are pretty clear that the massive Ottoman consolidation of Anatolia only truly came later.
It was built on the success they had in Europe first.
Exactly. It was predicated heavily on the prestige and, frankly, the wealth they won in Europe. They looked west because the east was this congested, brutally competitive landscape of equally matched Turkish rivals. The easiest target, surprisingly, was the ancient, crumbling Byzantine Empire.
And this brings us to what we've dubbed the fatal invitation, the ultimate Trojan horse moment.
Yeah.
How on earth did a small Anatolian group get invited across the Dardanelles by the very civilization they would end up destroying?
It was pure Byzantine self-destruction. The empire was in the throes of a debilitating civil war. You had Emperor John Cantacuzene fighting his rival, John Paleologos.
And Cantacuzene got desperate.
Completely. He essentially outsourced his defense and his offense. He paid Orhan Ghazi for 20,000 soldiers, and this is the crucial part. He promised him a fortress in the Thracian Chersonese to use as a forward operating base.
20,000 soldiers is a huge number when your own state might only be able to field a few hundred core fighters. And the price Cantacuzene paid was just staggering.
It was. Our sources note he was literally robbing churches and pawning the imperial jewels just to meet the payroll for these Turkish auxiliaries.
Wow.
Yeah. And this initial movement into Europe, which was led by Orhan's eldest son, Soliman Pasha, was profound for the Ottoman military itself. This wasn't just a deployment, it was a military education.
So they're getting paid to learn.
Exactly. The Turkish forces are marching on the historic military roads of the Byzantine Empire. They're fighting under the walls of major cities like Adrianople and even Constantinople itself. They saw the immense wealth, the fertile lands, and critically, the total political and military paralysis of the Byzantine world.
They were paid to study their future prey.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And the sources are very specific about the critical turning point. It's not when they were invited over, but when they decided to permanently stay.
That moment happened in 1352. The Ottomans occupied a place called Simpe Castle on the Dardanelles.
So they're no longer just mercenaries.
No, now they are residents in Europe. It gave them a non-negotiable base. And then just 2 years later, in 1354, a severe earthquake hits the region.
And they take advantage of the chaos.
They do. They seize the major prize, the city of Gallipoli.
Capturing the gateway, Gallipoli, the vital bridgehead. Why was that city so strategically important?
Gallipoli controlled the European side of the Dardanelles. It was the absolute gateway for any expansion into the Balkans. By possessing it, they could move men, supplies, and, more importantly, settlers from Asia Minor into Europe without any Byzantine control.
This establishes that first international branch we talked about.
Yes, and it immediately transitions them into a transcontinental threat.
And the most incredible detail from the sources is that even the Byzantines' own trade rivals, these powerful Italian maritime republics, they actually encouraged this Ottoman presence, at least at first.
This is where you see the complete failure of Christian solidarity. The Genoese, who were constantly at war with the Venetians, were noted in our sources as openly welcoming Orhan's support.
As long as it hurt their rivals.
Right. Provided it meant the destruction and death of their competitors, the Venetians and the Greeks. They were so consumed by their own economic rivalry that they preferred an external Turkish power over their regional Christian rivals.
The short-sightedness is just astounding. So this single decade, the 1350s, it completely redefines the Ottoman trajectory. It flips their entire strategic calculus.
Absolutely. The transition was complete. They went from being a minor Anatolian beylik struggling for survival among its neighbors to suddenly being the dominant ascendant power in the Balkans. They established their geographic center of gravity in Europe, which was wealthier, less contested, and more strategically vital before they'd even finished conquering Asia Minor.
And that reversal gave them the resources and the political platform for the next generation of leadership to truly start building an empire. Okay, so Orhan set up the first branch office in Europe. Now we move to his son, Murad I, the true systems architect. We're covering the years 1362 through 1389.
Right. And Murad didn't just want more land. He wanted a state that could actually endure.
He understood that controlling the Hellespont wasn't enough. You had to control the surrounding land.
Exactly. So his first major strategic move was establishing a new capital in Europe. Shortly after he comes to the throne, he captures Adrianople, which is modern Edirne.
Our sources give a few different years for that capture, 1361, 1362, maybe the latest 67 to 69. But regardless of the exact date, the implication is massive. The Ottoman capital is now in Europe.
This was a huge political statement, but it was also a critical military strategy. By moving the seat of power across the Dardanelles, Murad placed the entire political and military gravity of this nascent empire firmly in the Balkans.
He's signaling that Europe is the priority.
He is. It meant they were strategically positioned to manage and fund the systematic conquest of the rich, decentralized lands of Southeast Europe. And that conquest, in turn, would fund the eventual, much harder consolidation of Asia Minor.
This move also raises the stakes, right? When you commit to Europe, you have to have a truly professional standing army. You can't just rely on tribal levies or, feudal cavalry anymore.
And that necessity gave rise to his great military innovations. specifically the Janissaries and the devshirme system.
This is the core reason the empire survives the next century.
It is. Murad needed a fighting force that was professional, permanently available, and loyal only to him, the Sultan. A force immune to all the regional, tribal, or aristocratic loyalties that were so common among the existing Turkish forces.
And that force was the Janissary Corps, the Yeniçeri, the new soldiery.
Exactly.
And this professional corps was fed by the infamous devshirme system, the so-called blood tax or child levy. Can you break down the mechanism and just the sheer audacity of this system?
The audacity lies in the premise itself. It involved the forcible recruitment of Christian boys, usually aged between 12 and 20, from the subject populations in the Balkans.
They were just taken from their families.
They were. They were taken, converted to Islam, and then put through this rigorous training to become either the empire's elite soldiers or its top bureaucrats.
Now, on the surface, this sounds absolutely horrific. But our sources point out this complex duality of the devshirme. It wasn't just an act of oppression.
No, it was profoundly complex. On one hand, the grief was very real. Our sources describe the parting of mothers and sons as often a heartbreaking thing to witness, especially for families rooted in their Christian faith. It was a clear demonstration of Ottoman dominance, a violation of community integrity.
But on the other hand,
the system was the ultimate engine of upward social mobility. It was almost revolutionary for the 14th century. Well, for the vast majority of the rural population, the system offered something that was impossible under feudal systems: guaranteed opportunity. Many parents were genuinely glad their sons were chosen because it was an escape from grinding poverty.
it offered a first-rate training and the possibility of a great career.
Precisely. A peasant's son could literally rise to become the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister.
I find that anecdote about the Muslim families trying to game the system particularly illuminating. It really shows you the perceived value of this opportunity.
Oh, it speaks volumes. Turkish parents, who were legally exempt from this, envied them the opportunity so much that they sometimes tried to evade the regulations by paying Christians to take their Muslim sons and declare them as Christian children so that they might be enrolled as the Sultan's slaves.
Wow.
It was recognized as the fastest, most meritocratic path to power in the entire empire.
And this brings us to the centerpiece, the daring experiment, the Ottoman ruling institution. The Janissaries were the military face, but the color, the Sultan's slave family, they were the engine of governance.
Our sources call this system perhaps no more daring experiment has been tried on a large scale upon the face of the earth.
That's a strong statement.
It is. The entire foundation of the state rested on this concept. Taking men who were legally property slaves and making them ministers and courtiers. It systematically bypassed all the old power structures.
So what were those old power structures he was trying to bypass? Was it the religious scholars or the established Turkish aristocracy?
Primarily the ghazi lords, the powerful old Turkish families of Anatolia. These groups had deep local roots, hereditary land claims, and provincial loyalties that often conflicted with the Sultan's centralized authority.
So this new system just disregards all of that.
It grandly disregarded that fabric of fundamental customs, which is called human nature, because it stripped away the two pillars of traditional power, ancestry and independent wealth.
Okay, so how did this system ensure total loyalty? What were the specific mechanisms that made sure these powerful men remained dependent on the Sultan?
There were two key mechanisms. First, the state rigorously judged talent. It never asked who was your father, but judged pure ability, saying, you shall be a soldier or a governor and a prime minister.
So it's a true meritocracy.
It is, which ensures the best men serve the state. And the second mechanism was control over wealth and property.
How'd that work?
Unlike the feudal nobles of Europe or the old Turkish aristocracy, the color were given no certain hold on property. Their wealth was technically the Sultan's. Upon dismissal, or most commonly upon death, the Sultan could and often did claim their amassed property. This system was called musader.
So if a minister knew his wealth would be confiscated when he died, he had no incentive to build an independent power base for his family.
Exactly. His family wouldn't benefit, so why challenge the Sultan? It's a ruthless but brilliant economic constraint. It guaranteed that the highest office holders were constantly aware of the sword raised above their heads, ensuring absolute dedication to the sovereign.
But this kind of radical systemic change must have generated massive internal resistance. Did the established Turkish nobles just accept seeing Christian-born slaves occupy the highest ranks?
Absolutely not. This was a source of tremendous friction. particularly between the color system and the traditional Turkish ghazi element, the ones who had founded the state.
So they saw them as upstarts.
They did. These old military families viewed the janissaries and the palace bureaucrats as upstarts, inferior, tainted by their Christian origins. Our sources show this friction was a constant internal challenge that Murad and later sultans had to manage.
So let's talk about those military dynamics. What kind of military edge did this professional force actually give them?
Well, for one, the janissaries were technologically cutting edge. They were among the very first standing armies in Europe, or the Near East for that matter, to widely adopt muskets and cannons. They formed this professional infantry corps.
And how did that firepower integrate with their traditional cavalry, the Sipahis?
They operated as a devastating combined arms unit. The janissaries provided the shock power and stability in the center with their early firearms. The Sipahis, on the other hand, were highly mobile, relying on tactics very similar to those of the Mongol Empire.
The famous crescent formation.
Yes. The Sipahis would use high-speed maneuvers, often feigning a retreat to lure the enemy into the center, and then the janissary firepower and the disciplined infantry would close the trap. This combination allowed them to carve out Balkan hegemony despite massive resistance.
And Murad was relentless in his European campaigns. There were Christian coalitions that formed against him, right? I'm thinking of the one that defeated the Ottomans at Plonik in 1388.
Right, that defeat at Plonik shows Ottoman success wasn't inevitable, but it also demonstrates their resilience. A single setback didn't halt the overall expansion. Murad captured strategic cities like Sofia in 1385, which effectively neutralized much of the Bulgarian resistance.
And the climax of his reign, a defining moment for the entire region, was the Battle of Kosovo Polje in 1389.
This battle pitted Murad against a massive, unified Christian coalition, led chiefly by the Serbian Prince Lazar. The Ottomans ultimately won, consolidating their power in the Balkans and setting the stage for centuries of Ottoman rule.
The Serbian state was crippled, basically forced into vassalage.
Oh, right. They had to pay tribute and supply troops to the Sultan, but the personal cost was monumental.
The shocking fact is that both Murad and Prince Lazar died on the battlefield.
They did. Murad I remains the only Ottoman sultan in history to be killed in the midst of a military campaign. The machine he built was instantly tested. The sovereign was dead. The question was, would the infrastructure survive the transition?
The machine survived. Murad I was succeeded by his son, Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt.
Yeah.
This is the third generation of our rapidly growing startup. If Murad was the COO, Bayezid was the hyper-aggressive CEO.
Absolutely. His focus was maximum expansion, total market domination, regardless of the risk.
Bayezid, or Yildirim, earned his nickname for his speed, his ability to rapidly move armies between Europe and Anatolia. But his very first act on the throne signaled a brutal hardening of the system.
He was all about securing the dynasty.
Right, the dark side of succession. Upon learning of his father's death on the battlefield of Kosovo, Bayezid immediately had his own brother, Yaqub, executed.
To prevent any challenge to the throne, this was the culmination of what they called the open succession problem. Because any son born to the Sultan could theoretically inherit, the state was constantly vulnerable to these debilitating civil wars.
So Bayezid's act of fratricide was a brutal but pragmatic solution.
It was. And it would later be institutionalized by Mehmed the Conqueror with a law explicitly stating that whichever son succeeds to the throne may lawfully put his brothers to death for the stability of the realm.
This shift toward ruthless centralization seems to have been reflected in his personal behavior as well.
It did. The sources link Bayezid's rule to the beginning of criticism about the Sultan's increasing isolation and autocracy. He began limiting access to his person. For example, he refused to join his followers for communal Friday prayer.
Instead, he just built a mosque near his palace.
Exactly. He was moving away from the pastoral, approachable leadership of his grandfather, Orhan, toward a much more inaccessible imperial style.
And this new centralized autocracy immediately faced a massive external challenge. Europe finally responded with the Last Great Crusade, 1396.
The victory at Kosovo had prompted Europe to act. An enormous combined European army, French, Hungarian, Wallachian forces marched to relieve the pressure on the Balkans. They met Bayezid at the Battle of Nicopolis on the Danube.
And Bayezid crushed them, utterly. This victory was existential for Europe.
It was decisive. Nicopolis effectively vaporized any Western hope of halting the Ottoman expansion for decades. It confirmed the Ottomans' military supremacy and Bayezid's personal status as the champion of Islam.
And our sources have that wonderfully descriptive quote from the Hungarian King Sigismund, the leader of the Crusaders.
Oh, yeah. Sigismund watched the rash, proud French knights, who had refused to wait for the main battle line to form, just charge headlong into the Ottoman defenses.
And he knew it was over.
He famously lamented that they would lose the day through the great pride and folly of these French. Their arrogance and lack of coordination proved fatal.
But wasn't Bayezid relying heavily on forces that were technically his defeated enemies at this point?
He was, and that's a surprising detail the sources make clear. The very Serbian vassals he had just defeated, led by a man named Stephen Lazarevich, provided crucial support at Nicopolis.
So they were forced to fight under his banner.
They were, and their timely arrival likely saved Bayezid from a tough situation. It confirmed the efficacy of the vassalage system his father had established. Bayezid celebrated by sending gifts of prisoners, including captured French nobles, to Muslim princes across the world to showcase his overwhelming victory.
Now dominant in the West, Bayezid turned his aggressive expansionary strategy east, focusing on that hostile takeover, Anatolian consolidation.
This is where he really broke with the tradition of his predecessors. Orhan and Murad had prioritized Europe. Bayezid aggressively focused on uniting Asia Minor under central Ottoman control. In 1397, he annexed powerful rival Turkish principalities like Karaman.
Then he pushed even further east.
Right, conquering Mamluk-held cities like Malatya and Elbistan in 1399.
Why was this annexation of fellow Turkish principalities so much more politically volatile than conquering Christian lands in the Balkans?
Because the Turkish beyliks saw themselves as equals, or even superiors. They were all heirs to the Seljuk tradition. Bayezid's aggressive consolidation wasn't seen as liberation or expansion. It was seen as betrayal and tyranny by his neighbors.
So when he seized their lands, their deposed rulers didn't just disappear.
No, their deposed emirs and nobles immediately fled to the court of a far greater, more distant power, Timur. This act of swallowing up the entire Anatolian market created a catastrophic border with the ultimate monopoly.
And at the same time, he's keeping the pressure constant on the crumbling Byzantine Empire by blockading Constantinople.
After Nicopolis, Bayezid was confident enough to impose and maintain a long-term blockade and active siege, starting around 1394. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel was left with no option but to acknowledge Ottoman suzerainty and pay tribute. The city was isolated and slowly strangling.
But this siege highlights a strange temporary weakness of the Ottoman Empire.
It highlights the impotence of the Osmanlis on sea. Our sources stress this. Despite Bayezid's massive armies and cannons surrounding the city walls, he couldn't stop resupply by water.
So a united Christian naval force could have broken the siege.
Easily. The powerful fleets of Venice and Genoa could have lifted the siege and resupplied Constantinople indefinitely.
And once again, Christian division saved the Ottomans.
Yes. The bitter trade rivalries between Venice and Genoa prevented any unified action. They were unwilling to cooperate, allowing Bayezid to sustain constant pressure on Byzantium while he focused his military attention on his hostile takeover in Anatolia.
So Bayezid was truly at his zenith.
He was master of the Balkans, controller of Anatolia, with Constantinople just teetering on the brink.
Bayezid's quest for total market saturation brought him into direct confrontation with a power he perhaps didn't fully comprehend. And now we arrive at the catastrophic turning point, the Clash of Titans, the Battle of Ankara in 1402.
This wasn't a regional skirmish. This was the fast-growing startup running into the established, overwhelming global monopoly. Timur, or Tamerlane, led an immense force from Central Asia, an army that dwarfed Bayezid's and was hardened by decades of conquest across Persia, India, and Russia.
So Timur represented a traditional established empire that Bayezid's new centralized state just couldn't compare to in scale or history.
Not even close. And the sources confirm that those deposed Anatolian emirs who fled Bayezid, they went straight to Timur's court and encouraged this confrontation.
That's a crucial detail.
It is. Timur wasn't just invading, he was acting, at least in his view, as the restorer of legitimate rulers against a tyrant Bayezid who had unlawfully annexed his Muslim neighbors. Timur's invasion force even included war elephants. I mean, it demonstrated a scale and logistics the Ottomans were just not prepared for.
The two armies met in July 1402 at the Battle of Ankara, and our sources point to immediate critical tactical errors by Bayezid.
Bayezid's arrogance, likely fueled by his easy victory at Nicopolis, betrayed him. First, his army was utterly exhausted. Bayezid had forced his troops on these rapid marches across Anatolia in the height of the summer heat. They were fatigued and dehydrated before the battle even began.
And he chose to fight immediately. No retreat.
He decided on immediate battle. He missed the opportunity to retreat into the mountains, recuperate, and use scorched earth tactics to force Timur to exhaust his massive logistics train chasing them. This overconfidence was fatal.
Especially when combined with the internal instability of his newly conquered forces.
And that instability led to the ultimate betrayal.
The Anatolian troops.
Yes. The outcome was a rout, dramatically weakened by the mass desertion of his Anatolian Turkish auxiliaries, the very troops he had just annexed. When the battle turned against Bayezid, these men, seeing the opportunity to restore their local princes, just switched allegiance to Timur en masse.
They preferred the established legitimacy of the great world conqueror over the aggressive new authority of Bayezid.
They did.
The consequences were just unprecedented for the Ottomans, the captive sultan, and the near-death experience.
Bayezid I was captured in person. Our sources highlight this humiliation. It was the first and only time in the 6th century history of the Ottoman Empire that a reigning sultan was taken alive in battle. He died in captivity in March 1403.
And this marked the effective death of that aggressive expansionary startup model.
Yes. And Timur, the ultimate monopoly, then systematically worked to dismantle the competitor entirely.
He immediately undid Bayezid's decade of aggressive consolidation.
He did. He restored the deposed emirs or their heirs to the rival Anatolian principalities, Karamania, Edirne, Sarukan, all the rest. The territory Bayezid had fought to unite was instantly shattered, returning the region to the fragmented state it was in decades earlier.
So the Ottoman state had collapsed, geographically and politically, but complete annihilation was narrowly avoided due to an incredible twist: the Great Escape.
Timur's Tartars pursued the remaining Ottoman forces relentlessly toward the straits, intent on wiping them out. But the remaining core of the army, primarily the Janissaries and the loyal elements, managed to flee back into Europe.
And they survived because of the strange actions of their nominal enemies.
Right. The Greeks and Latins, the same Genoese and Venetians who had refused to cooperate to break the siege of Constantinople, suddenly became ferry operators.
They did what?
Our sources note that the Greeks and Latins vied in helping the refugees to cross from Asia back into Europe. They provided this rapid shuttle service for the fleeing Ottoman soldiers and their officers.
But why? Why rescue the army that was literally blockading your city?
Because of the principle of better the devil you know. The Byzantines and Italians feared Timur infinitely more than the Ottomans. Timur represented a much larger, unpredictable, and devastating power.
He could completely disrupt the balance of power.
Exactly. They preferred the familiar, contained threat of the Ottomans to the vacuum that would be created by Timur's total victory. And that action prevented the total annihilation of the institutional Ottoman military machine.
Nevertheless, the state was utterly crippled. It entered a decade-long period known as the Interregnum, Fetret, lasting from 1402 to 1413, a brutal fratricidal civil war between Bayezid's surviving sons that nearly destroyed the empire. So, what does this all mean? We've traced this dizzying history from pastoral folk to transcontinental power in 50 years, followed by a total catastrophic crash at Ankara.
The startup went bankrupt, the CEO died captive, and the entire structure was forcibly carved up.
And yet, they survived. That survival is the answer to our central question. The ultimate restoration of the empire, allowing Mehmed I to finally unify the throne by 1413 and continue the expansion. It proves that the institutional systems built by Murad were resilient enough to withstand all of that.
They could withstand the death and capture of the sovereign, the loss of virtually all of Asia Minor, and a decade of debilitating civil war.
The power wasn't in the individual sultan, but in the system of governance itself. The resilience factor was the audacity of that ruling institution.
It was an act of profound social engineering. Think about it. When Bayezid's army routed at Ankara, who remained loyal, not the Anatolian Turkish auxiliaries they deserted.
It was the core institutional loyalty of the color, the slave family.
Exactly. The Janissary commanders and the palace-trained bureaucrats in Europe who owed their entire existence, wealth, and status solely to the sovereign power, they are the ones who held the fragmented European territories together.
So this system successfully leveraged a population, its Christian subjects, that the traditional religious establishment, the ulema, viewed as dirty, inferior, and unequal to supply the manpower, for its most elite soldiers and its highest officials.
And because the color system ignored traditional aristocratic bloodlines, focusing purely on talent, and maintained that constant threat of property confiscation, musadere, it provided a clear path of upward mobility regardless of birth. This meritocracy guaranteed a supply of competent, loyal administrators who were entirely dependent on the state.
The reliance on non-native, highly trained personnel, the color, was the true, deep foundation, the secret of the gilded sword. It functioned even when the head of state was missing.
Indeed. The interregnum was terrible, but those institutional structures, the centralized bureaucracy, the loyalty of the janissaries, and the strategic positioning in Edirne provided a framework for order in the critical European core.
So the state managed to function independently of the monarch's individual power.
Which was a revolutionary concept in an age defined by feudal personal rule.
So the history of the early Ottomans offers a sharp lesson not just in conquest, but in governance. The empire survived its bankruptcy because of the daring experiment in social engineering conducted by Murad I. And consider this. The system designed to perpetuate absolute loyalty to the Sultan through the meritocratic advancement of Christian-born slaves ultimately proved capable of sustaining the entire state structure even when the Sultan himself was gone and the dynasty was plunged into civil chaos. This foundation, built on competence rather than blood, is why the House of Osman was able to return, not just to survive, but to expand and finally conquer Constantinople just 50 years later. The institutional ingenuity is definitely something worth exploring further.